Back through some elections here, just to give you a sense of what's going on politically. In 1804, 1800, of course, the Virginian Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. Jefferson had been Secretary of State before he was president. In 1804, Jefferson easily crushes Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. As you can see, 162 electoral votes to 14. In 1808, Jefferson's Secretary of State and fellow Virginian James Madison will win fairly easily again against Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. You see the New England states tend to be the only ones disagreeing in significant numbers here. In 1812, Madison wins re-election over DeWitt Clinton of New York. Again, you see the New England states voting for the Federalist candidate, but the Virginian former Secretary of State Madison wins not as easily, but still relatively easily. In 1816, James Monroe, also a Virginian, also a former Secretary of State, will win again. The only states he loses, of course, are Delaware, but then the New England states. So you should be seeing a pattern here. And this is really the end of the Federalists. Remember, the Federalists had come out against the War of 1812 right as it ended, which was a terrible mistake. And this will be the last election the Federalists will field a candidate. And so in 1820, we have the only election in American history where there is no opposition. Now, you notice that one elector votes for John Quincy Adams, but James Monroe essentially runs completely unopposed. And this marks the end of the first party system, the end of the Federalist. It's also what we call part of the end of what we call, or the last election of what we call the Virginia dynasty. If you look at the presidents from 1789 until 1824, every single one, except for the 4 years of John Quincy Adams, was a Virginian. And Northerners begin to get very angry, claiming that there is this kind of Southern dominance of the government and feeling left out. Well, we call this period the era of good feelings, not because there were no problems and everybody was happy, but because there was only one political party, and so there was not significant opposition. And so Monroe, was largely uncriticized. In fact, shortly after his 1816 victory, he will tour the nation and be cheered everywhere he goes. The economy is booming. We don't appear to have any foreign threats with the British having left the New World. The Federalist Party is gone. As a symbolic gesture, James Monroe will give the job of Secretary of State to John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, and a Federalist who is converted to the Democratic Republicans now because the Federalists have died. And that's really important because notice, with the exception of John Quincy Adams, and of course Washington was first, every single president up to this point has been the former Secretary of State. So by making Adams the Secretary of State, you're pointing to the idea that he's going to become president in 1824 when Monroe follows Washington's example like Jefferson and Madison did and only serves for 8 years. Henry Clay was actually, who we'll talk about a lot as we go forward, was actually offered the job of Secretary of War, another person who had identified with the Federalists to some extent. No, scratch that. That's not true. But he declines the job, while John C. Calhoun, who again is going to become a major player for us later here, will take the job of Secretary of War. So there's John Quincy Adams, who will be, for what it's worth, one of the great diplomats in all of American history. He had negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. He negotiated an important treaty with Russia called the Rush-Bagot Treaty. He was an expansionist. He believed in adding as much land to America as possible. And in 1817, he begins negotiating with Spain to buy Florida. We did not like having that little Spanish section down there where slaves ran to and Native Americans attacks were staged out of. The Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, will order Andrew Jackson, who's now become a general in the American Army, to, quote, adopt the necessary measures to stop the Native American raids from Florida. Jackson will respond to this fairly vague order by simply invading Florida and going to war with the Seminole Indians there. This is called the Seminole War. And seizing the Spanish fort. He attacks the Spanish at Pensacola. He puts up an American flag and begins organizing a government. So Jackson steals Florida. Now, John Quincy Adams is negotiating to buy Florida, but Jackson is impatient and just takes Florida. Calhoun, the Secretary of War, tells Jackson he has to give Florida back, but Jackson refuses. Meanwhile, John Quincy Adams, negotiating with the Spanish ambassador, Onís, will explain to him, you might as well sell it to us because we have it right now, and even if we give it back, we can just take it back whenever we want. America used the thin argument that it was okay for us to seize Spain from them because they weren't doing enough to stop the Native American raids. But all this resulted in the Adams-Onis Treaty, which involved Spain giving Florida to America and us giving up our claim to Texas. We were still claiming that Texas was part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so we basically do a swap. This map here, which is from the time, is of an American eagle, which by then had become our symbol, being drawn with Florida as the talons. And this really expresses this idea of American nationalism, expansionism, of American growth, I think very nicely. The Napoleonic Wars created a huge European market for food. During the wars, of course, the boys were out fighting, and the land was being destroyed. And so it was very, very difficult for the Europeans to feed themselves, so they began buying lots of food from America. Well, that meant prices went up, and the American farmer did incredibly well during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Farmers invested in land. They took out huge loans because they were making huge profits. And there was a speculation boom in Western land. People were paying lots of money to go out and get Western land. Lots of banks popped up because it seemed like the money would never stop flowing. Both state-chartered banks and wildcat banks, which are banks that have no permission to operate. They offered easy credit and printed paper money. And this was also during the period when there was no Bank of the United States, of course. The Bank of the United States would only offer credit if you had gold to put up for it. You had to put some gold down, and then they would loan you some more money. But most people didn't have any gold to put up. Of course, after the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe gets back on its feet, begins producing food again, the market for food will slow down. Europe will not demand as much. The price of food will collapse. And all these people who had borrowed all this money to buy this Western land will find themselves unable to make the payments on their land. The banks call in the loans. The smaller banks collapse altogether because people can't pay them back. And we enter, as you can see here, into a depression, an economic collapse. This will last for 6 years. Many people saw this as part of the danger of expansion and unregulated capitalism, but most didn't question the idea that America should grow and business should be encouraged to grow as much as possible. Now, in 1820, we have a new crisis when Missouri asked for statehood. Now, the problem is we have a balance between 11 free states and 11 slave states. And since every state gets 2 senators, that meant that the Senate was perfectly balanced. So if pro-slavery legislation came through, the anti-slavery states could block it and vice versa. So adding one more slave state would tip the balance in favor of the South. The North was already angry because all the presidents except John Adams were Southerners. And so the question about what to do with Missouri becomes a problem. A representative from New York named Talmadge proposed an amendment banning slavery in Missouri, and the South freaks out. This will eventually be resolved when Maine asks to break off from Massachusetts and become its own state. And Henry Clay will craft the Missouri Compromise. And what this says is that both Maine and Missouri will be admitted, so now there will be 12 slave states and 12 free states, restoring balance. But it also says that there will be no slavery above this black line here, this Missouri Compromise line that runs between Missouri and Arkansas. Obviously, the states that already have slavery get to keep it, but there will be no new slavery above that line. Clay is praised as the great compromiser for this, and this, at the time, people tend to think this solved the slavery issue. We know today, of course, all they were doing was kicking the can down the road, making this a problem for future generations. And it also seems clear to me, and I think to most historians, that the Southerners intended to take Texas and what today we call California and New Mexico and extend this Missouri Compromise line all the way across, because it seems difficult to believe that the Southerners were willing to limit the expansion of slavery to this yellow area while giving up all this blue area to the free states. That's hard to imagine. So I think we should also see this as a clear indication that there was an understanding that America was going to continue to expand right into Mexico.